Have you ever wondered what it would be like to simply vanish? Not in tragedy, not in death, but to be so close to the divine that the boundary between earth and heaven becomes permeable. Imagine waking up one morning, going about your daily routine, when suddenly something extraordinary happens. You don't die. You don't suffer. You don't even say goodbye. You simply aren't there anymore because God has taken you. Picture this scenario. You're a parent watching your children grow up in an increasingly corrupt world. Every day brings fresh evidence that humanity is spiraling toward moral collapse. Violence fills the streets. Deception governs business. Cruelty has become entertainment. Hope seems like a luxury only the naive can afford. Yet somehow, in the midst of this darkness, you discover a way to walk so closely with God that death itself becomes irrelevant. Or consider this paradox. What if I told you that the most violent, chaotic era in human history produced the most intimate relationship between God and man ever recorded, that in the time when wickedness reached its peak, when every imagination of human hearts was only evil, continually one man found a path to such perfect communion with the divine that he bypassed mortality altogether. This isn't fantasy. This isn't mythology. This isn't wishful thinking or religious fiction. This actually happened to a man named Enoch, and his story challenges everything we think we know about the limitations of human existence, the possibilities of faith, and the reality of divine relationship. In the next hour, you'll discover the most mysterious and hope-filled story in human history. You'll meet a man who lived in the most corrupt age our world has ever known, yet found a way to walk so closely with God that death couldn't touch him. You'll explore what it really means to have an authentic relationship with the Creator of the universe. You'll understand how one person's faithful choices can impact generations and change the course of history itself. But here's what will surprise you most. Enoch's story isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint, a roadmap, a living example for anyone who feels overwhelmed by the chaos of our modern world. His life proves that no matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the culture, no matter how hopeless the circumstances, transformation is possible. Intimacy with God is achievable. A life that matters for eternity is within reach. This is the story of transformation, of hope in hopeless times, of what happens when an ordinary person makes an extraordinary decision to align their life with heaven's rhythm. It's the story of a man who discovered that walking with God isn't just about religious duty or spiritual discipline. It's about finding the very purpose for which human beings were created. So, let's walk together. Let's discover what it really means to walk with God. Let's explore how the choices you make today could echo through eternity. Let's uncover the secret that enabled one man to live so aligned with divine purpose that he stepped right out of mortality into eternity. Your journey toward understanding true spiritual transformation begins now. To understand Enoch's extraordinary end, we must first understand his very ordinary beginning. But ordinary is relative, isn't it? When we say Enoch had an ordinary beginning, we mean ordinary for his time. And his time was unlike any other in human history. Enoch was born into the seventh generation from Adam. Let that sink in for a moment. 7 generations. In today's terms, that would be like your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather having actually walked in the Garden of Eden with God. The memories of paradise weren't ancient history to Enoch's family. They were recent family history. The genealogical record reads like this: Adam begot Seth, Seth begot Enosh, Enosh begot Kenan, Kenan begot Mahalalel, Mahalalel begot Jared, and Jared begot Enoch. Each name in this lineage carries significance. Each generation represents a step further from the perfection of Eden and deeper into the consequences of human rebellion against God. But here's what makes this timeline so remarkable. These weren't just names on a family tree. These were real people who lived extraordinarily long lives by our standards. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 9 years. These weren't mythological figures or symbolic representations. They were Enoch's actual ancestors, some of whom he probably knew personally. Imagine growing up hearing first-hand accounts of what life was like in the early days of humanity. Imagine learning about the Garden of Eden not from ancient texts, but from relatives who heard the stories directly from Adam himself. Imagine understanding the consequences of sin not as abstract theology, but as lived family history. This genealogical context is crucial for understanding Enoch's world because it shows us that he lived at a critical juncture in human history. He was close enough to the beginning to remember what humanity was supposed to be, yet far enough from Eden to see what humanity had become. By the time Enoch was born, something had gone terribly wrong with the human experiment. The earth had become filled with violence. Corruption spread like a plague through every community, every family, every heart. This wasn't just moral decline or cultural shift. This was moral collapse on a scale that defies imagination. Genesis tells us that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Try to picture what that means. Not just that people occasionally made bad choices, but that their very thought processes had become corrupted. Not just that society had problems, but that the fundamental orientation of human consciousness had turned away from good and toward evil. Can you imagine living in such a world where cruelty had become entertainment, where violence was the normal way to resolve disputes, where deception was standard business practice, where the vulnerable had no protection and the powerful showed no mercy, where justice was a foreign concept and compassion was seen as weakness? This was the world into which Enoch was born. A world where the gap between what humanity was created to be and what humanity had become was growing wider every day. A world rushing toward divine judgment because it had abandoned divine principles. A world where hope seemed like naive optimism and faith appeared to be foolish fantasy. Yet, somehow, in this environment of universal corruption, one family maintained a different trajectory. Enoch's lineage through Seth represented what scholars call the godly line in human history. While the descendants of Cain pursued earthly power, wealth, and pleasure without regard for moral consequences, the descendants of Seth maintained some connection to the God who had created them. This doesn't mean they were perfect. It doesn't mean they were immune to the corruption around them, but it does mean they preserved the memory of who God was and what relationship with Him was supposed to look like. They remembered that human beings were created for divine fellowship, not just earthly existence. Enoch's father was Jared, whose name means descent. And some scholars suggest this could refer to a spiritual descent in the culture around them, or perhaps to the descent of divine beings mentioned cryptically in Genesis chapter 6. Regardless of the exact interpretation, Jared lived 962 years and was part of this godly lineage that refused to completely abandon hope in God. Picture Enoch's childhood and young adulthood. He would have grown up hearing stories not just about the distant past, but about the spiritual realities that most of his generation had forgotten. While his contemporaries pursued immediate gratification and temporal power, Enoch was raised in a family that remembered eternal perspectives. But this spiritual heritage also came with tremendous pressure. Being part of the godly line in an ungodly world meant being different. It meant being set apart. It meant facing social pressure, economic disadvantage, and probably ridicule from those who had embraced the corruption of their age. Imagine young Enoch looking around at the world and seeing the stark contrast between what his family believed about God and how everyone else was living. Imagine the questions that must have filled his mind. Is this faith really worth it? Does God really care about human affairs? Is there any point in trying to live righteously when everyone else has abandoned righteousness? These weren't abstract theological questions for Enoch. They were pressing practical concerns that affected every aspect of his daily life. Should he pursue business practices that would make him wealthy, but compromise his integrity? Should he conform to social customs that would make him popular, but abandon his principles? Should he give up on this God whom he couldn't see in favor of the tangible rewards that corruption seemed to offer? For 65 years, Enoch navigated these pressures. For 65 years, he lived as part of this godly lineage while surrounded by an ungodly world. For 65 years, he maintained some connection to God, while most of humanity was walking away from God. But then something happened that changed everything. Something that transformed Enoch from a man who knew about God into a man who walked with God. Something that shifted his relationship with the divine from inherited tradition to personal intimacy. That something was the birth of his son, Methuselah. Scripture tells us that Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. It's a simple statement, but it marks the most significant turning point in one of the most remarkable lives ever lived. Because the next verse says something unprecedented. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years. Notice that crucial phrase, after he begat Methuselah. The birth of this child didn't just make Enoch a father. It made him a man who walked with God. But why? What was it about becoming a parent that catalyzed such a profound spiritual transformation? To understand this, we need to consider what the name Methuselah might have meant. According to ancient Hebrew traditions, the name Methuselah can be interpreted as, when he dies it shall come, or his death shall bring. This suggests that when Enoch named his son, he received some kind of prophetic insight about the future. He understood that this child's death would mark the arrival of divine judgment upon the earth. Whether this interpretation is precisely accurate or not, we can imagine the profound impact that holding his newborn son must have had on Enoch's spiritual consciousness. Here was new life, innocent and pure, born into a world that was rushing toward destruction. Here was hope, incarnate, delivered into an age of despair. Here was the future of humanity, placed into the arms of a man who could see how dark that future was likely to become. Can you imagine the weight of that moment, the overwhelming sense of responsibility, the desperate desire to protect this precious life from the corruption that surrounded them, the urgent need to find some source of hope, some foundation of truth, some reason to believe that goodness could survive in a world gone mad? Perhaps it was the vulnerability he felt as a new father. Perhaps it was the overwhelming love that flooded his heart when he first saw his child. Perhaps it was the sudden realization that his choices would affect not just his own destiny, but the destiny of this innocent life entrusted to his care. Whatever the exact catalyst, something profound happened in Enoch's heart when Methuselah was born. The inherited faith of his family lineage became personal faith. The traditional belief in God became intimate relationship with God. The knowledge about divine truth became experience of divine presence. And from that day forward, Enoch began to walk with God. But what does that phrase even mean? Walking with God sounds spiritual and inspiring. But what did it look like in practical terms? How do you walk with an invisible God in a visible world? How do you maintain divine relationship while handling earthly responsibilities? How do you commune with eternal truth while dealing with temporal pressures? The Hebrew word translated walked is hashalak, and it's incredibly rich in meaning. It doesn't refer to a casual stroll or an occasional religious activity. It describes a way of life, a pattern of existence, a fundamental orientation of being. When someone walks in Hebrew, thought they're conducting their entire life according to certain principles and in certain directions. When the Bible says Enoch walked with God, it's describing a man who organized his whole existence around the presence and will of the Almighty. Not just his prayer time or his worship activities, but his work, his family relationships, his business dealings, his social interactions, his private thoughts, his public behavior, his decision-making processes, his emotional responses, his recreational activities, his financial choices, his time management, his priorities, his values, his goals, his dreams, his fears, his hopes, everything. This is what made Enoch's relationship with God so extraordinary. It wasn't compartmentalized. It wasn't something he did on certain days or in certain places. It was something he was every moment of every day for 300 years. Think about what this must have looked like in practical terms. When Enoch woke up in the morning, he didn't just think about his tasks for the day. He thought about how those tasks could be opportunities for fellowship with God. When he worked to provide for his family, he didn't just focus on productivity and profit. He saw his labor as a form of worship, a way of partnering with God in caring for the creation. When Enoch faced difficult decisions, he didn't just weigh the practical pros and cons. He sought divine wisdom and guidance. When he interacted with his neighbors, He didn't just consider social conventions or personal advantage. He tried to reflect God's character in every conversation, every transaction, every relationship. When conflicts arose in his family, Enoch didn't just react with human emotion or cultural norms. He responded as someone who was walking in partnership with the God of love and justice. When he saw the corruption and violence around him, he didn't just feel helpless or angry. He found his hope and strength in the God who had promised to make all things right. This is what distinguished Enoch from his contemporaries. They were walking according to human wisdom, cultural pressures, and immediate circumstances. Enoch was walking according to divine wisdom, eternal principles, and ultimate purposes. They were navigating life with purely human resources. Enoch was navigating life in partnership with infinite resources. The result was remarkable. While the world around him grew darker, Enoch grew brighter. While humanity was moving further from God, Enoch was moving closer to God. While society was becoming more corrupt, Enoch was becoming more pure. While others were losing hope, Enoch was gaining confidence in God's ultimate plan. But let's be clear about something. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The text tells us that Enoch walked with God for 300 years, 3 centuries. That's longer than the United States has existed as a nation. That's 15 times longer than most people's careers. That's about 4 times longer than most people live today. For 300 years, Enoch made the daily choice to align his life with God's character and purposes. For 300 years, he maintained this supernatural relationship while living in a natural world. For 300 years, he chose faith over doubt, hope over despair, love over hatred, truth over deception, righteousness over corruption. This wasn't 300 years of uninterrupted spiritual bliss. This was 300 years of daily decisions to trust God when circumstances were confusing, to obey God when obedience was costly, to hope in God when hope seemed unreasonable, to love like God when love wasn't reciprocated. Scripture tells us that after Methuselah was born, Enoch had sons and daughters. He was a family man with multiple children to raise a household, to manage a living, to earn relationships, to maintain. He faced all the same challenges that every parent faces. Children who disappointed him, financial pressures, health concerns, family conflicts, social obligations. The difference was that he faced these challenges not alone, but in partnership with God. Not with purely human wisdom, but with divine guidance. Not in his own strength, but in supernatural power. Not according to cultural norms, but according to eternal principles. And somehow, miraculously, this approach to life began to transform not just Enoch himself, but everything he touched. His family began to reflect God's character. His relationships began to demonstrate God's love. His work began to exhibit God's excellence. His influence began to point others toward God's truth. In a world where every imagination of human hearts was only evil, continually Enoch became a living demonstration that goodness was still possible. In an age where violence filled the earth, Enoch modeled peace. In a culture dominated by corruption, Enoch maintained integrity. In a society characterized by hatred, Enoch practiced love. he didn't do this perfectly. The Bible never claims that Enoch was sinless or infallible, but it does tell us that he walked with God, which means he lived in continuous fellowship with the source of all goodness, truth, and love. When he failed, he had access to forgiveness. When he struggled, he had access to strength. When he was confused, he had access to wisdom. This is what enabled him to maintain this supernatural relationship for 3 centuries. Not his own righteousness, but God's grace. Not his own strength, but God's power. Not his own wisdom, but God's guidance. Not his own love, but God's love flowing through him. The result was a life so aligned with divine purpose that it began to transcend normal human limitations. A relationship so intimate with the eternal that the temporal began to lose its hold. A character so transformed by divine grace that it became ready for divine translation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore the extraordinary end of Enoch's story, we need to understand the extraordinary journey that prepared him for that end. We need to see how 300 years of faithful walking with God shaped a man into someone ready for something that had never happened before in human history. We need to explore the tests, the challenges, the growth, the setbacks, the victories, the lessons, the relationships, the influence, the legacy that filled those 3 centuries of walking with God. Because Enoch's translation wasn't just a divine reward for good behavior. It was the natural result of a life that had become so perfectly aligned with heaven that earth could no longer contain it. The journey from ordinary man to translated saint began with a newborn baby and a father's decision to walk with God. Where that journey led would change not just Enoch's destiny, but the trajectory of human history itself. Now that we understand the context of Enoch's world and the beginning of his walk with God, we need to explore what that walk actually looked like over the course of 3 centuries. Because the truth is, walking with God for 300 years wasn't just an extended spiritual retreat or mystical experience. It was 300 years of daily choices, persistent faith, ongoing tests, continuous growth, and deepening relationship. Every step was a choice. Every day was a decision. Every year was a test of commitment. And through it all, Enoch had to learn how to maintain intimate fellowship with an invisible God while living in a very visible and increasingly hostile world. Let's imagine how the testing might have begun in those early years after Methuselah's birth. Picture Enoch, now in his mid-60s, trying to establish new patterns of spiritual discipline while managing the responsibilities of a growing family. The challenges were probably small at first, but they were significant in their cumulative impact. Consider the test of the morning prayer. In our modern world, we struggle to maintain consistent quiet time with God when we have alarm clocks, coffee makers, and climate-controlled homes. Imagine Enoch trying to establish a rhythm, a seeking God, before dawn in an ancient world without artificial lighting, with unpredictable weather, and with the constant demands of manual labor. Some mornings, his body ached from the previous day's work. Some mornings, his mind was clouded with worry about providing for his family in an increasingly violent world. Some mornings, one of his children was sick, or there was an urgent problem that demanded immediate attention, or the weather was so severe that stepping outside seemed unwise. But every morning, Enoch chose to walk with God, not just when it was convenient or when he felt like it, but as a fundamental commitment that took priority over comfort, convenience, or circumstances. This wasn't legalistic rule following. It was relational priority setting. Just as you would make time for the most important relationships in your life, Enoch made time for his relationship with God. Then there was the test of integrity in business dealings. In a world where corruption had become normal, where deception was standard practice, where might made right, and justice was a foreign concept, Enoch's commitment to honesty probably cost him financially. While his neighbors might have gained wealth through fraud, manipulation, or exploitation, Enoch chose to reflect God's character in every transaction. Picture him turning down profitable opportunities because they would require compromising his principles. Imagine him refusing to take advantage of others' desperation or ignorance, even when such exploitation was culturally acceptable. Think about him choosing to treat workers fairly, deal honestly with customers, and maintain integrity in partnerships, even when such choices put him at an economic disadvantage. This wasn't easy. Enoch had a family to support, children to provide for, and a future to secure. The temptation to occasionally bend the rules, to make small compromises for the greater good, to adopt a more flexible approach to ethics, must have been constant. But every day, in dozens of small decisions, Enoch chose to walk with God rather than walk with the culture around him. Perhaps the most challenging test of all was the test of patience in family relationships. Any parent understands this struggle. How do you respond when the children you're trying to raise in godliness make ungodly choices? How do you balance love and discipline, grace and accountability, mercy and justice? How do you maintain hope when your kids seem to be embracing the very corruption you're trying to protect them from? Enoch had multiple children, and the biblical record suggests he lived during the most morally challenging period in human history. His children grew up surrounded by violence, corruption, and spiritual darkness. They faced peer pressure that was literally life-threatening. They were tempted by pleasures that promised immediate gratification and by power structures that rewarded moral compromise. Some of them probably rebelled. Some of them probably made choices that broke Enoch's heart. Some of them probably questioned why their family had to be different, why they couldn't just live like everyone else, why their father's faith had to make their lives so complicated. But Enoch learned to respond the way God responds to his disappointing children, with perfect love that refuses to compromise truth and perfect truth that never abandons love. He learned to discipline without anger, to correct without condemnation, to maintain standards without losing relationship, to express disappointment without withdrawing affection. This required supernatural wisdom, patience, and emotional strength that only comes from walking closely with God. Enoch couldn't parent effectively in his own strength because the challenges his children faced were beyond normal human experience. He needed divine guidance for every conversation, supernatural love for every conflict, and eternal perspective for every crisis. And with each small test passed, each faithful choice made, each step taken in the right direction, Enoch's capacity for greater faithfulness increased. His spiritual muscles grew stronger through exercise. His character became more stable through testing. His relationship with God deepened through consistent communion. But as Enoch's reputation for godliness grew, so did the social pressure to conform. In a society that had largely abandoned moral standards, his lifestyle became a constant rebuke to those around him. His integrity highlighted their corruption. His peace exposed their anxiety. His hope challenged their despair. His faith confronted their skepticism. Imagine the invitations he received and declined. Come on, Enoch, live a little. Stop being so serious about this God business. Nobody else cares about these ancient traditions anymore. You're missing out on all the pleasures and opportunities that life has to offer. Your children are going to resent you for making them different. Your business is suffering because you won't adapt to modern realities. The test of belonging when righteousness makes you an outsider is one of the most difficult challenges any believer faces. There's a deep human need to be accepted, to fit in, to be part of the group. Social isolation is genuinely painful, and the pressure to conform can be overwhelming, especially when you're the only one in your community trying to live according to different standards. But Enoch discovered something profound. It's better to walk alone with God than to walk with others away from God. The presence of the Almighty more than compensates for the absence of human companionship. The approval of heaven outweighs the disapproval of earth. The fellowship with the eternal satisfies the soul in ways that temporal relationships never could. This doesn't mean Enoch became antisocial or withdrew from human community. The biblical record indicates that he remained engaged with his generation, even serving as a prophet who delivered divine messages to them. But it does mean that his primary relationship, his deepest friendship, his most intimate fellowship, was with God himself. As the decades passed, this unique relationship began to set Enoch apart in ways that were both wonderful and sometimes painful. Spiritual maturity often leads to spiritual loneliness. The closer you walk with God, the more you realize how few others are making that same journey. The deeper your understanding of divine truth becomes, the more foreign the thinking of your culture appears. But God began to use Enoch's faithfulness to impact others. The New Testament tells us that Enoch was also a prophet, which means he delivered divine messages to his generation. And these weren't comfortable, encouraging messages designed to make people feel better about themselves. They were challenging warnings about divine accountability, calls to repentance, and proclamations of coming judgment. Behold, Enoch declared, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them, of all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Can you imagine the courage this required, standing before people who had embraced violence and corruption and telling them that God was going to hold them accountable? Speaking truth to a generation that had rejected truth, calling for repentance from people who had forgotten what sin even was, proclaiming divine justice to those who had abandoned human justice. These weren't popular messages. These weren't comfortable proclamations. These were the kinds of warnings that made enemies not friends. the kinds of pronouncements that put the messenger at risk, the kinds of truths that people preferred not to hear. But what made Enoch's prophetic ministry so powerful wasn't just his words, it was his walk. For decades, his life had been a living demonstration of what it looked like to take God seriously. When Enoch warned about judgment, people couldn't dismiss him as a hypocrite because they had watched him live with integrity for years. When he called for righteousness, they could see righteousness embodied in his daily choices. When he spoke about the reality of God, they had observed him walking with that God through every circumstance. The authenticity of his walk gave authority to his words. The consistency of his character gave credibility to his message. The reality of his relationship with God gave power to his proclamations about God. This brings us to perhaps the greatest test of all, the test of perseverance, when results seemed invisible and opposition was constant. For decades, Enoch delivered divine messages to his generation. For decades, he lived as a righteous example in an unrighteous world. For decades, he maintained hope in the face of increasing corruption. But did anything change? Did people repent? Did society improve? Did his influence make any visible difference in the moral trajectory of his culture? The historical record suggests that the answer was largely no. If anything, conditions got worse during Enoch's lifetime. The corruption that had characterized his early years became even more extreme. The violence that had filled the earth became even more brutal. The rejection of God that had marked his generation became even more complete. From a purely human perspective, Enoch's prophetic ministry appeared to be a failure. His example seemed to be ignored. His warnings went unheeded. His calls for repentance fell on deaf ears. The world continued its rush toward divine judgment despite his faithful testimony. This is where many people would have given up. This is where discouragement would have overwhelmed hope. This is where the temptation to compromise, to conform, to stop fighting a battle that seemed unwinnable would have become irresistible. But Enoch had learned something crucial. His job wasn't to convert people. His job was to be faithful to the message God had given him. His responsibility was obedience, not results. His calling was to speak the truth, not to make the truth popular. His role was to walk with God, not to make others walk with God. And through it all, he kept walking. Through decades of apparent failure, he maintained his relationship with God. Through years of social isolation, he continued his spiritual disciplines. Through seasons of discouragement, he persevered in hope. Through periods of opposition, he remained faithful to his calling. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of walking with God, maintaining faithfulness when you can't see the results you hoped for. Continuing to obey when obedience seems pointless. Persisting in hope when hope seems naive. Believing in God's goodness when all circumstances suggest otherwise. But Enoch's apparent failure was actually preparing him for his ultimate success. His perseverance in the face of opposition was building character that would make him ready for translation. His faithfulness, despite invisible results, was developing a quality of faith that would please God so completely that death itself would become irrelevant. The test of time is perhaps the most revealing test of all. It's one thing to be faithful for a year or 5 years or even a decade. It's quite another to maintain spiritual discipline and devotion for 3 centuries. Most people struggle to keep New Year's resolutions for 3 months. Enoch kept his commitment to God for 300 years. Think about the spiritual disciplines that Enoch must have maintained throughout this period. The daily prayers that became routine yet never lost their meaning. The weekly rhythms of worship and reflection that created space for deeper communion with God. The annual observations that mark time not by human achievements, but by divine faithfulness. There must have been seasons when the walk felt effortless, when God's presence was tangible and His direction was clear. There must also have been seasons of spiritual dryness, when heaven seemed silent and the path forward seemed unclear. There were probably times when Enoch felt like he was walking on air and times when he felt like he was walking through quicksand. But through every season, every circumstance, every emotion, every challenge, Enoch had learned the secret of long-term faithfulness. You don't walk by feelings, you walk by commitment. You don't continue because you feel inspired. You continue because you've made a covenant. You don't persevere because the path is easy. You persevere because the destination is worth it. Something remarkable happens when you walk with God consistently over extended periods of time. You don't just develop spiritual habits, you develop spiritual character. You don't just learn spiritual truths, you become a spiritual truth. You don't just practice spiritual disciplines, you become a spiritual person. After decades of walking with God, Enoch's life had become so aligned with God's character that the distinction between human and divine began to blur. Not that Enoch became God, but that he became everything God intended humanity to be. Not that he stopped being human, but that he became fully human in the way God originally designed humans to be. The Hebrew text describing Enoch's ultimate fate is fascinating. It doesn't say Enoch died and then God took him. It says he was not, for God took him. There's a sense in which Enoch's transformation was so complete that death became irrelevant. His life had become so aligned with eternity that mortality couldn't contain him. But let's not forget that through all of this, Enoch remained a family man. He wasn't a monk who retreated from human relationships to focus on his spiritual life. He was a husband and father who had to navigate the complexities of family leadership while maintaining his walk with God. This presented unique challenges that most spiritual disciplines don't address. How do you maintain perfect communion with God while dealing with a crying baby at 3 a.m? How do you demonstrate divine love when your teenager is rebelling against everything you've taught them? How do you model heavenly peace when your household budget won't balance and your marriage is under stress? Enoch had to learn that walking with God isn't about escaping human responsibilities, but about fulfilling them with divine resources. He discovered that spiritual maturity isn't measured by your ability to avoid challenges, but by your ability to face challenges with God's strength, wisdom, and character. Imagine the conversations around the dinner table as his children grew older. "Dad, why can't we do what the other families do? Why do we have to be different? Why do you spend so much time praying? When you could be making more money, why won't you let us participate in the activities that everyone else enjoys? Why does our faith have to make our lives so complicated?" Enoch had to find ways to help his family understand that their different lifestyle wasn't about restriction. It was about relationship. That their spiritual disciplines weren't burdens, they were blessings. That their separation from cultural norms wasn't judgment of others, it was alignment with God's standards. That their commitment to walking with God was the greatest gift he could give them. And somehow, against all odds, in the midst of the most corrupt generation in human history, Enoch succeeded in passing his faith to the next generation. We know that his son Methuselah lived longer than any other human being in recorded history, not years. But more importantly, Methuselah continued the spiritual legacy his father had established. The name that had once carried the prophecy of judgment became part of the lineage that would eventually produce Noah. Enoch's faithfulness in walking with God didn't just affect his own destiny, it created a spiritual inheritance that lasted for generations. His great-grandson Noah would also be described as one who walked with God. Think about that for a moment. Enoch's decision to walk with God, made in response to his son's birth, created a spiritual legacy that would eventually save the human race. When the flood came, when divine judgment finally fell upon the earth, just as Enoch had prophesied, it was Enoch's spiritual descendant who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the power of authentic spiritual leadership in the family. It doesn't just change you, it changes your children and your children's children and their children after them. The choices you make about walking with God today could influence people you'll never meet, in times you'll never see, in ways you'll never fully understand. As the years passed and Enoch's walk with God deepened, something unprecedented began to happen. The boundary between human and divine, between temporal and eternal, between earth and heaven, began to blur. This wasn't pantheism or mysticism or some kind of New Age spirituality. This was the natural result of a human life becoming perfectly aligned with divine purpose. Enoch wasn't becoming God, but he was becoming everything God intended humanity to be. He wasn't losing his humanity, but he was finding the full potential of what humanity could become when properly connected to its Creator. He wasn't escaping the physical world, but he was demonstrating what physical existence could look like when informed by spiritual reality. Can you imagine the spiritual sensitivity Enoch must have developed after 3 centuries of walking with God? He probably perceived spiritual realities that others couldn't see. He probably heard God's voice with a clarity that others couldn't imagine. He probably experienced God's presence with an intensity that others couldn't comprehend. The material world probably became increasingly transparent to him, while the spiritual world became increasingly solid. The temporary probably seemed less real, while the eternal probably seemed more substantial. The human probably felt more limited, while the divine probably felt more natural. This growing alignment with heavenly reality was preparing Enoch for something that had never happened before in human history, something that would demonstrate to every generation that followed the ultimate possibility of walking with God, something that would serve as both promise and preview of what God ultimately intended for all who choose to walk with Him. In the final years of Enoch's earthly journey, the tests must have been different from those early challenges. No longer was God testing whether Enoch would remain faithful. Now, God was testing whether Enoch was ready for what He had planned. No longer was the question whether Enoch could maintain his walk with God. Now the question was whether Enoch had become so aligned with God that he could step into a reality beyond normal human experience. The Bible tells us that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But before God could take him, Enoch had to be ready to be taken. This required a level of spiritual maturity, a degree of separation from earthly attachments, a quality of faith that had never before been achieved by a human being. Enoch had to become so heavenly minded that he was ready to leave earth behind. But here's what's remarkable. This didn't make Enoch less human. It made him more human. It made him the kind of human that God always intended humanity to be. Every test had prepared him for this moment. Every faithful choice had built toward this destination. Every step he had taken with God had been leading him closer to a threshold that no human had ever crossed. The testing was complete. The journey of faithfulness was finished. The walk was about to take Enoch somewhere no human had ever gone. But the impact of his faithful journey was just beginning. And now we come to the moment that changed everything. The moment that transformed Enoch from a footnote in genealogy into one of the most remarkable figures in human history. The moment when an ordinary man's extraordinary faithfulness was rewarded in a way that had never happened before and would only happen once again in all of Scripture. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him, for before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. These words from the 11th chapter of Hebrews give us the theological framework for understanding what happened to Enoch. But theology, as important as it is, can sometimes feel abstract. Let's try to imagine what this unprecedented event might have looked like from a human perspective. Picture a day that began like any other day in Enoch's 300-year walk with God. The sun rises over the ancient world, painting the sky with the same colors that had marked 10,000 dawns before. Enoch awakens as he has for over a century of years before the rest of his household stirs. He rises from his bed, careful not to disturb his family, and steps outside into the cool morning air. The world is quiet. The violence and corruption that characterize his generation are temporarily silenced by sleep. In this precious silence before the chaos of human activity begins, Enoch starts his morning walk with God. This isn't just physical exercise, though he probably does walk physically. This is spiritual communion, emotional connection, intellectual engagement with the Creator of the universe. But today is different. As Enoch begins his morning routine of prayer and meditation, he senses something unusual in the atmosphere. The presence of God, which has become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat over 3 centuries, seems more tangible than usual. The boundary between the physical and spiritual realms, which has been growing thinner throughout his walk, seems almost transparent today. The air itself seems to shimmer with divine presence. The very molecules around him seem to vibrate with heavenly energy. The ordinary morning light takes on an extraordinary quality, as if it's being filtered through dimensions beyond normal human perception. Enoch doesn't feel alarm or fear. After 300 years of walking with God, he has learned to recognize divine visitation. He has experienced God's presence in countless ways throughout his long journey. But today feels different. Today feels final. Today feels like culmination. As he walks and prays, something unprecedented begins to happen. The physical world around him doesn't disappear, but it begins to fade in significance. The spiritual realm doesn't suddenly appear because it has always been there, but it begins to become more solid, more real, more present than the material reality he has known all his life. It's not that Enoch is leaving his body behind. It's that his body is being transformed into something that can exist comfortably in both realms simultaneously. It's not that he's dying and going to heaven. It's that heaven is coming to him, enveloping him, claiming him, translating him from one mode of existence to another. The Hebrew word translated took in Genesis chapter 5 is the same word used when God took a rib from Adam to create Eve. It suggests not violent removal, but gentle extraction for a divine purpose. God isn't snatching Enoch away from earth. God is lifting Enoch up to heaven. There's no pain in this process. There's no struggle or resistance. There's no fear or confusion. Just a gentle, natural transition from the temporal to the eternal, from the mortal to the immortal, from the earthly to the heavenly. It feels like coming home after a long journey. It feels like waking up from a dream into reality. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. One moment, Enoch is walking on earth with God. The next moment, he's walking in heaven with God. The relationship continues uninterrupted. The fellowship remains unbroken. The difference is location, not connection. And he was not, for God took him. That simple phrase contains the most extraordinary event in human history up to that point. Enoch didn't die, death. The consequence of sin that had claimed every human being since Adam had no power over a man who had walked so closely with God that he had essentially stepped out of death's jurisdiction. But what about his family? Can you imagine the confusion and concern when Enoch simply failed to return from his morning walk? Picture Methuselah, now over 3 centuries old, himself waiting for his father to come home for breakfast. Picture Enoch's other children wondering where their father could be. Picture his grandchildren asking why grandfather was taking so long. At first, there must have been concern, then worry, then panic. Search parties would have been organized, the countryside would have been scoured, rivers would have been dragged, caves would have been explored, every possible explanation would have been considered and investigated. But as hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, a different understanding began to emerge among those who knew Enoch best. This wasn't tragedy. This wasn't accident. This wasn't loss. This was something entirely unprecedented. Gradually, the initial grief and confusion of Enoch's family would have given way to awe, wonder, and perhaps even a strange kind of pride. Their husband, their father, their grandfather had been found worthy of something that no other human being had ever experienced. He hadn't been taken by death. He had been taken by God. Think about the conversations that must have followed in Enoch's family and community. Think about how this event would have been discussed, debated, questioned, and proclaimed. Did you hear about Enoch? He didn't die. God just took him. Some probably doubted. Some probably created elaborate theories to explain what really happened. Some probably dismissed it as impossible. But those who knew Enoch best, those who had watched his 300-year walk with God, those who had witnessed his growing spiritual maturity and deepening divine relationship, probably weren't surprised at all. They had seen this coming. They had watched him become more and more like God and less attached to earthly concerns. They had observed his increasing spiritual sensitivity, his growing intimacy with the divine, his deepening separation from the values and priorities of fallen humanity. They had noticed how he seemed to become more comfortable in God's presence than in human company. They had seen how his conversation increasingly turned to eternal matters rather than temporal concerns. Enoch's translation wasn't sudden from their perspective. It was the culmination of 3 centuries of faithful steps in the right direction. It was the inevitable destination of a life lived in perfect harmony with the will of God. It was the logical conclusion of a story that had been building toward this moment for over a quarter of a millennium. But Enoch's translation was more than just a reward for his personal faithfulness. It was a message to the entire human race. A declaration that death is not inevitable for those who walk closely with God. A demonstration that fellowship with the divine can overcome the gravest consequences of sin. A preview of what God ultimately intends for all who choose to walk with him. In a world that was rushing toward judgment, where wickedness had reached unprecedented levels, where hope seemed naive and faith appeared foolish, Enoch's translation was a beacon of divine possibility. It said to anyone willing to listen, this is what's possible. This is where faithfulness leads. This is what happens when a human life is perfectly aligned with divine purpose. The theological implications of Enoch's translation are staggering. Here was proof that the relationship between God and humanity could be restored to its original intention. Here was evidence that the consequences of sin could be overcome through faithful relationship with the Creator. Here was a preview of resurrection, a glimpse of eternal life, a demonstration of divine power over death itself. But perhaps most remarkably, Enoch's translation was a preview of what would happen centuries later, when another man would walk so perfectly with God that death would have no power over him. When Jesus Christ would die on a cross for the sins of humanity, and then rise from the dead 3 days later, he would be demonstrating the same truth that Enoch's translation had foreshadowed. Perfect fellowship with God overcomes death itself. The difference was that Enoch was taken up without dying while Jesus died, and then was raised up. But both events point to the same reality. Death is not the final word for those who walk with God. Both demonstrate that divine relationship has power over human mortality. Both prove that God's ultimate intention for humanity transcends the limitations of fallen existence. Enoch's translation also served as a source of hope for every generation that followed. When righteous people suffered and died while wicked people seemed to prosper, they could remember Enoch. When faith seemed pointless and godliness appeared unrewarded, they could look back to the man who walked with God and was taken up. When prophets like Elijah felt alone and discouraged, when kings like David faced overwhelming enemies, when exiles like Daniel lived in hostile cultures, when apostles like Paul endured persecution, they could draw strength from Enoch's example. They could remember that God sees, God remembers, and God rewards those who diligently seek Him. The writer of Hebrews includes Enoch in the great hall of faith, alongside Abraham, Moses, and other spiritual giants. But notice what makes Enoch unique in that list. He's the only one who didn't die. He's the only one whose faith was so complete that it led not just to divine approval, but to divine translation. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death. Faith was the key. Not perfect performance, but persistent faith. Not flawless obedience, but faithful relationship. Not religious achievement, but relational authenticity. This tells us something crucial about what God is looking for in human beings. He's not looking for perfection in the sense of sinless performance. He's looking for faith in the sense of trusting relationship. He's not demanding flawless behavior. He's desiring faithful fellowship. Enoch pleased God not because he never made mistakes, but because he never stopped walking. He satisfied divine requirements not because he achieved moral perfection, but because he maintained relational connection. He qualified for translation not because he earned it through good works, but because he received it through faithful relationship. This is both humbling and encouraging. Humbling because it reminds us that human effort alone can never achieve divine approval. Encouraging because it assures us that divine relationship is available to anyone willing to walk by faith. Now, let me ask you something personal. As you consider Enoch's extraordinary end, how does it make you feel about your own mortality? How does it change your perspective on what's possible in your relationship with God? How does it affect your understanding of life's ultimate purpose and meaning? Because here's the truth. While none of us may experience the physical translation that Enoch experienced, all of us can experience the spiritual transformation that made his translation possible. All of us can develop the kind of relationship with God that transcends the limitations of mortality. All of us can walk so closely with God that death becomes not an enemy to be feared, but a doorway to something even more wonderful. Enoch's translation tells us that our highest calling isn't just to live for God, but to live with God. Not just to serve Him from a distance, but to walk with Him in intimacy. Not just to obey His commands, but to enjoy His presence. Not just to fear His judgment, but to anticipate His pleasure. When we do that, something extraordinary happens. We begin to partake of His nature. We begin to share His life. We begin to experience a quality of existence that transcends the merely human. We begin to live in such harmony with eternity that mortality becomes less and less significant. Is this what God intends for all of us? Is Enoch's experience meant to be exceptional, or is it meant to be a pattern? The Bible seems to suggest that Enoch's walk with God is indeed a model for all believers, that his intimacy with the divine is the kind of relationship God desires with every human being. If that's true, then Enoch's story isn't just history, it's prophecy. It's not just telling us what happened to one remarkable man in the distant past. It's showing us what's possible for every person who chooses to walk with God today. The same God who walked with Enoch is available to walk with you. The same relationship that transformed Enoch's life can transform your life. The same faith that pleased God in Enoch can please God in you. The same divine power that translated Enoch beyond death can give you life beyond the grave. But this raises an important question. If walking with God can lead to such extraordinary results, why don't more people choose this path? Why don't more believers experience the kind of intimate relationship with God that Enoch enjoyed? Why don't more lives demonstrate the transforming power of divine fellowship? The answer, I think, lies in the cost. Walking with God requires everything. It demands total surrender, complete commitment, absolute priority. It costs comfort, convenience, and control. It requires faith when circumstances suggest doubt, hope when experiences counsel despair, love when others offer hatred. Most people want the benefits of walking with God without paying the price. They want divine blessing without divine lordship. They want heavenly reward without earthly sacrifice. They want spiritual transformation without behavioral change. But Enoch's story shows us that authentic relationship with God cannot be compartmentalized or compromised. It must become the organizing principle of your entire existence. It must take priority over every other relationship, pursuit, or pleasure. It must be more important than life itself. This doesn't mean becoming a religious fanatic or withdrawing from normal human life. Enoch remained engaged with his family and community throughout his 300-year walk. But it does mean that everything else in your life must be secondary to your relationship with God. When that happens, when walking with God becomes your highest priority and deepest desire, when pleasing Him matters more than pleasing anyone else, when His approval becomes more important than human applause, then you begin to experience the kind of transformation that made Enoch ready for translation. You may not be physically taken up as he was, but you will be spiritually lifted up in ways that transcend normal human experience. You may not bypass physical death as he did, but you will experience eternal life that begins here and now and continues forever. Enoch's translation wasn't just the end of his earthly journey, it was the beginning of his eternal adventure. And it was a promise to every human being who has ever wondered whether walking with God is really worth the cost. The answer is yes. It's worth everything. Because when you walk with God, you don't just gain a religion. You don't just adopt a philosophy. You don't just embrace a moral system. You enter into the very life of God Himself. You become part of the eternal story that began before creation and will continue after the universe passes away. That's what Enoch discovered. That's what his translation demonstrated. That's what his story still proclaims to anyone willing to listen. Walking with God doesn't just change your destination, it transforms your journey. It doesn't just affect your afterlife. It revolutionizes your present life. And it all begins with a single step. Now that we've witnessed Enoch's extraordinary translation, we need to understand something crucial. His story didn't end when he was taken up. In many ways, it was just beginning. Because the legacy of a life lived in perfect harmony with God doesn't disappear when that life transitions from earth to heaven. It continues generation after generation, shaping families, influencing communities, and pointing people toward the same relationship with God that made such transformation possible. Let's trace the spiritual DNA that Enoch passed down through his lineage and examine how his 300-year walk with God created ripples that are still expanding today, thousands of years later. Remember, Enoch's son was Methuselah, whose name prophetically meant, "When he dies, it shall come." Methuselah lived nigh 169 years longer than any other human being in recorded history. But more significantly than his longevity, he carried forward the spiritual legacy his father had established. Think about what it must have been like to be Methuselah. Your father doesn't die a normal death. He simply disappears one day because God takes him. How do you process that kind of loss? How do you understand that kind of honor? How do you live up to that kind of spiritual heritage? But Methuselah did more than just survive his father's unprecedented departure. He thrived spiritually. The biblical record suggests that he continued the godly lineage that Enoch had represented. He maintained faith in the same God who had found his father so pleasing that he bypassed the normal human experience of death. From Methuselah came Lamech, and from Lamech came Noah. Notice what Genesis says about Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. There it is again, that same phrase that characterized Enoch's life, walked with God. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't cultural accident. This was legacy. This was spiritual inheritance. This was the direct result of Enoch's decision made over 6 centuries earlier to walk with God in response to his son's birth. When the flood came, when divine judgment finally fell upon the earth. Just as Enoch had prophesied, it was Enoch's spiritual descendant who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It was Enoch's great-grandson who was chosen to preserve humanity and give the world a fresh start. Think about that for a moment. Enoch's faithfulness didn't just secure his own relationship with God and his own eternal destiny. It created a spiritual lineage that would literally save the human race. When God looked for someone worthy to restart human civilization after the flood, he found that person in Enoch's family line. This demonstrates something profound about the nature of spiritual legacy. The choices you make about walking with God today don't just affect you. They don't just influence your immediate circumstances or your personal destiny. They create patterns, establish precedents, and set trajectories that can impact people you'll never meet in times you'll never see, in ways you'll never fully understand. But Enoch's influence extended far beyond his direct family line. Throughout Scripture, we see references to Enoch that suggest his story became a source of hope and inspiration for generations of believers who face similar challenges of living faithfully in unfaithful times. The New Testament writer of Hebrews includes Enoch in the great hall of faith, alongside Abraham, Moses, and other spiritual giants. The Apostle Jude quotes from Enoch's prophecy, showing that his words continued to carry weight and authority centuries after he was taken up. What's remarkable is how a man who never wrote a book that survived, never built a monument that endured, never conquered a nation, never accumulated great wealth, never achieved political power, could have such lasting impact. His influence came not from what he accomplished in the world's eyes, but from who he became in God's eyes. Enoch's legacy wasn't built on platform or performance. It was built on character. It wasn't based on external achievements, but on internal transformation. It didn't depend on human recognition, but on divine approval. It wasn't measured by temporary success, but by eternal significance. This raises important questions about how we think about influence and legacy in our modern world. We tend to measure impact by external metrics. How many followers someone has on social media, how much money they've accumulated, how famous they've become, how many people know their name, how much power they wield. But Enoch's story suggests a completely different way of thinking about lasting influence. The most powerful legacy you can leave isn't built on public achievement or popular recognition. It's built on the quality of your relationship with God and the authenticity of your walk with Him. It's built on the daily choices you make when no one is watching. It's built on the integrity you maintain when it would be easier to compromise. It's built on the faithfulness you demonstrate when circumstances are difficult. It's built on the love you show when others offer hatred. It's built on the hope you maintain when others surrender to despair. Enoch's legacy was so powerful because it was so authentic. For 300 years, his private life matched his public persona. His character was consistent whether he was alone with God in prayer or addressing crowds as a prophet. His walk with God wasn't a religious performance designed to impress others. It was a genuine relationship that transformed every aspect of his existence. This is what made his influence so lasting and so powerful. People can fake performance, but they can't fake character. People can manipulate public perception, but they can't manufacture authentic spirituality. People can build temporary fame through clever marketing or strategic positioning, but only genuine godliness creates eternal impact. The authenticity of Enoch's walk gave authority to his words. The consistency of his character gave credibility to his message. The reality of his relationship with God gave power to his influence on others. When people watched Enoch live, they weren't just seeing human effort or religious behavior. They were seeing what it looked like when divine life flowed through human personality. Now, it's important to note that not everything attributed to Enoch in ancient literature comes from reliable biblical sources. There are various apocryphal books and traditions that claim to contain Enoch's writings and teachings. While these texts can provide interesting insights into how ancient cultures viewed Enoch, we must be careful to distinguish between biblical revelation and human tradition. The Bible gives us the essential facts about Enoch. He walked with God for 300 years. He prophesied to his generation about coming judgment, and he was taken up without experiencing death. These are the reliable foundations upon which we can build our understanding of his life and legacy. But what we can say with complete confidence is that Enoch's influence on biblical history is profound and lasting. His example of walking with God becomes a template that reappears throughout Scripture. His translation becomes a preview of resurrection hope that encourages believers in every generation. His prophecies about divine judgment establish him as one of the earliest voices calling humanity to accountability before God. Perhaps most importantly, Enoch's legacy reminds us that one person walking faithfully with God can impact eternity. His influence rippled forward through his family line, producing Noah, who became the father of the post-flood world. It rippled forward through his prophetic ministry, providing hope for believers who faced persecution and judgment throughout history. It rippled forward through his example of faith, inspiring countless others to pursue deeper relationship with God. And it ripples forward even today, challenging us to consider what kind of legacy we're building through our own daily choices. Think about this. Enoch lived in the most corrupt, violent age in human history up to that point. Yet his faithfulness created a spiritual legacy that outlasted all the empire's achievements and monuments of his generation. The powerful men of his day are forgotten. The wealthy merchants who accumulated great fortunes are unknown. The influential leaders who shaped politics and culture have passed into obscurity. But Enoch's name is still spoken with reverence thousands of years later. His story is still told in churches around the world. His example still inspires people to walk more closely with God. His legacy still challenges believers to live with eternal perspective in temporal circumstances. This is the power of a life lived in quiet faithfulness to God. This is the influence that comes from walking consistently with the Almighty. This is the legacy that matters when everything else fades away. Enoch's story teaches us that the most important question isn't, how can I make my mark on the world? But rather, how can I walk so closely with God that His mark is made on me? Because when God's character is imprinted on your life, when your walk with Him becomes authentic and consistent, when your relationship with the divine becomes the organizing principle of your existence, then you begin to influence eternity. You begin to shape destinies. You begin to create a legacy that will outlast anything this world considers significant. You begin to participate in God's eternal purposes in ways that transcend your ability to understand or imagine. The quiet man who walked with God for 300 years has been speaking to humanity for thousands of years. His life continues to whisper to us across the centuries, "This is possible. This is what God intended. This is where faithfulness leads." And that whisper becomes a call, an invitation, a challenge for each of us to begin our own walk with God. Not to replicate Enoch's exact experience, but to discover our own version of what it means to walk with God in our generation, in our circumstances, with our unique personalities and challenges and opportunities. Enoch's legacy proves that God is looking for people in every generation who will choose to walk with Him regardless of cultural pressures, social expectations, or personal costs. He's looking for people who will prioritize relationship with Him above everything else. He's looking for people who will live for eternity while dwelling in time. The question is, will you be one of those people? Will your life create the kind of legacy that outlasts your earthly existence? Will your walk with God influence others in ways that ripple forward through generations? Will your faithfulness contribute to God's eternal purposes in the world? Enoch's story suggests that the answer depends not on your talents, your resources, your opportunities, or your circumstances. It depends on your willingness to walk with God one day at a time, one step at a time, one choice at a time, for as long as He gives you breath. The same God who walked with Enoch is waiting to walk with you. The same relationship that transformed Enoch's life can transform your life. The same faith that pleased God in Enoch can please God in you. The same divine power that created a legacy through Enoch can create a legacy through you. But it all begins with a decision to start walking. And it continues with a commitment to keep walking regardless of circumstances for as long as God gives you the opportunity. So, what does this mean for us today? How do we apply the lessons of Enoch's life to our modern world? How do we walk with God in the 21st century? How do we build the kind of relationship with the divine that could transform not just our own lives, but the lives of generations yet to come? The beauty of Enoch's story is that it's not complicated. It's not mystical or mysterious or requiring special revelation or supernatural gifts. It's actually quite simple, which makes it accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any time, in any circumstances. Walking with God doesn't require a seminary degree or special spiritual gifts or perfect circumstances or unlimited time or extraordinary resources. It requires what Enoch demonstrated, a daily decision to align your life with God's character and purposes. Let's get practical. Let's talk about what walking with God looks like in your daily routine, in your relationships, in your work, in your challenges, in your ordinary everyday life. Because if Enoch could walk with God while raising a family in the most violent civilization in history, you can walk with God in whatever circumstances you're facing today. First, walking with God begins with carved out time for solitude and prayer. Notice that Enoch's walk started after Methuselah was born, when his responsibilities actually increased rather than decreased. He didn't wait for life to become less busy. He didn't postpone intimacy with God until his schedule cleared up, or his children grew up, or his work demands lessened. He made time for God because he understood that relationship with the Creator isn't a luxury to be enjoyed when convenient. It's a necessity to be prioritized regardless of circumstances. It's not something you do when everything else is taken care of. It's something you do so that everything else can be taken care of properly. This doesn't mean you need to pray for hours every day, though some seasons of life might call for extended time with God. It means you need consistent daily time where you deliberately focus on God's presence and listen for His voice. Maybe it's 15 minutes in the morning before anyone else wakes up. Maybe it's a walk around the block after work where you talk with God about your day. Maybe it's a few minutes before bed where you reflect on God's faithfulness and grace. The key isn't the length of time as much as the consistency of choice. Enoch walked with God for 300 years, not because he had one great spiritual experience that sustained him for centuries, but because he made the same choice every single day for over 10,000 days. Your walk with God will be built the same way, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one step at a time. The daily discipline of meeting with God becomes the foundation for a lifetime of walking with God. Second, walking with God means bringing Him into your everyday decisions and activities. Enoch didn't compartmentalize his spiritual life. He didn't have God time and regular time, sacred space and secular space, religious activities and normal activities. His whole life became a conversation with God, a collaboration with the divine, a partnership with the eternal. This might mean pausing before you respond to that difficult email to ask for wisdom and grace. It might mean inviting God's perspective when you're making a financial decision or career choice. It might mean recognizing God's presence during mundane tasks, like washing dishes, commuting to work, or folding laundry. It might mean asking yourself, how would someone who walks with God handle this situation when you're faced with a challenging relationship or ethical dilemma? It might mean looking for ways to reflect God's character in every conversation, every transaction, every interaction throughout your day. Walking with God isn't about being religious in the sense of performing certain rituals or maintaining certain appearances. It's about being relational in the sense of including God in everything you do, just like you would with any close friend or family member. Third, walking with God requires integrity in small things. Remember, Enoch's transformation didn't happen overnight. It was built through thousands of small choices: to do right when no one was watching, to tell the truth when lies would be easier, to show kindness when selfishness would be more profitable, to maintain standards when compromise would be more convenient. Your character is formed in the details of daily life. How you treat the person who serves your coffee. How you respond when someone cuts you off in traffic. How you handle money when you're alone. How you speak about others when they're not present. How you react when technology doesn't work properly. How you behave when you think no one is watching. These small moments are where walking with God becomes real and authentic. These everyday choices are where your relationship with God is either strengthened or weakened. These ordinary situations are where you either practice the presence of God or ignore His existence. Fourth, walking with God means staying faithful through difficult seasons. Enoch lived through 3 centuries, which means he experienced every kind of human challenge, loss and disappointment, rejection and criticism, physical pain and emotional stress, family problems and financial struggles, social pressure and cultural change. Yet he never stopped walking. He never gave up on God, even when circumstances might have suggested that God had given up on him. He never concluded that faithfulness was pointless, even when faithfulness seemed to produce no visible results. Your walk with God won't eliminate life's difficulties, but it will transform how you navigate them. Instead of facing challenges alone, you'll face them in partnership with the God who loves you Instead of being overwhelmed by circumstances, you'll find strength and wisdom that come from beyond yourself. Instead of becoming bitter or cynical, when life doesn't go as planned, you'll develop the kind of character that actually grows stronger under pressure. Instead of losing hope when problems persist, you'll maintain confidence in God's ultimate goodness and sovereignty. Fifth, walking with God includes being part of a community of faith. While Enoch's walk was deeply personal, it wasn't isolated. He was part of a family, connected to a community engaged with his generation. He didn't retreat from human relationships in order to focus on his divine relationship. Your spiritual growth will be enhanced by relationships with others who are also seeking to walk with God. This might mean joining a small group at your church where you can share your struggles and victories with others on the same journey. It might mean finding a mentor who can guide you in spiritual disciplines and biblical understanding. It might mean becoming a mentor yourself, helping someone else take their first steps in following God. It might mean simply being honest with friends about your faith and inviting them to join you in discovering what it means to walk with God. Here's a simple weekly practice that can help you evaluate and strengthen your walk with God. Every week, perhaps on Sunday evening or Saturday morning, ask yourself these 5 questions. How did I create space for God in my schedule this week? Where did I sense God's presence or guidance in my daily activities? What small choices did I make that reflected God's character? How did I remain faithful to God during difficult moments? Who did I encourage or serve as part of my walk with God? These questions aren't meant to create guilt or pressure. They're meant to help you notice where God is already working in your life and where you might want to be more intentional about walking with Him. They're designed to help you see patterns, recognize progress, and identify areas for growth. Remember, faith isn't about giant leaps or dramatic transformations. It's about consistent steps in the right direction. Enoch didn't have one dramatic encounter that transformed his life forever. He had thousands of ordinary days where he chose to walk with God rather than walk alone. Those ordinary days lived faithfully added up to an extraordinary life. Those consistent choices made daily created a character ready for divine translation. Those small steps, taken repeatedly, led to a destination no human had ever reached. You don't need to be perfect to begin walking with God. You don't need to have all the answers or overcome all your struggles or fix all your problems before you start. You just need to take the next step, just like Enoch did, just like every person who has ever discovered the joy and peace that comes from walking in partnership with the Creator of the universe. God is inviting you into the same relationship He had with Enoch. Not necessarily the same translation experience, but the same walking relationship, the same daily communion, the same partnership in life's journey, the same transformation from the inside out, the same hope that transcends circumstances, the same peace that surpasses understanding. And here's the beautiful truth. Just like Enoch's faithful walk influenced generations after him, your decision to walk with God won't just change your life. It will create ripples that extend far beyond what you can see or imagine. Your children will be affected by your example. Your friends will notice the transformation in your character. Your community will be impacted by your choices. Your legacy will be shaped by your faithfulness. The man who walked with God for 300 years is still inspiring people to walk with God today. His story continues to whisper across the centuries, "This is possible. This is what God intends. This is where faithfulness leads." But now that whisper becomes a personal invitation to you. Now that ancient example becomes a contemporary challenge. Now that historical account becomes a present opportunity. The question isn't whether walking with God is possible. Enoch already proved that it is. The question isn't whether God desires relationship with human beings. Enoch's translation already demonstrated that he does. The question isn't whether faithfulness makes a difference. 300 years of walking, followed by divine translation, already established that it does. The only remaining question is whether you're ready to take the first step, whether you're willing to begin your own journey of walking with God, whether you're prepared to discover what He might do in and through a life that's fully surrendered to His love and purposes. So here's my challenge to you. Here's my invitation. Here's my encouragement. Today, right now, wherever you are, whatever your circumstances, whatever your past, whatever your questions or doubts or fears, take one step toward God. Just one step. Not a giant leap of faith that feels overwhelming. Not a dramatic transformation that seems impossible. Not a perfect commitment that feels unattainable. Just one simple, small, manageable step in God's direction. Maybe that step is a simple prayer. God, I want to learn to walk with you the way Enoch did. I don't understand everything about faith or spirituality or religion, but I want to understand you. Show me how to begin. Help me take the first step. Maybe that step is setting aside 10 minutes tomorrow morning to read a passage from the Bible and ask God to speak to your heart through it. Start with the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and read about Jesus. Ask God to help you understand who He is and what He wants for your life. Maybe that step is reaching out to someone you trust who seems to have a genuine relationship with God and saying, I want to grow spiritually. I want to understand what it means to walk with God. Will you help me? Will you answer my questions and guide me as I explore faith? Maybe that step is simply making a decision. I'm going to start paying attention to God's presence in my daily life. I'm going to start including Him in my decisions. I'm going to start walking with Him instead of walking alone through life. Maybe that step is attending a church service this week, not as a religious obligation, but as someone genuinely seeking to understand God better. Go with an open heart and mind. Listen for truth. Look for authenticity. Ask questions. Explore possibilities. Maybe that step is confession, acknowledging to God that you've been walking through life without Him, that you've made mistakes and poor choices, that you need His forgiveness and guidance. The Bible promises that if you confess your sins, God is faithful and just to forgive your sins and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Remember, every great journey begins with a single step, and Enoch's journey to eternity. Enoch's 300-year walk with God. Enoch's transformation from an ordinary man into someone ready for translation, it all began with one small decision to respond to God's invitation. That same invitation is extended to you today. Not to be taken up like Enoch was, but to be transformed like Enoch was. Not to escape the world like Enoch did, but to impact the world like Enoch did. Not to walk away from life, but to walk through life in partnership with the one who gave you life. The path is before you. The invitation has been given. The God who walked with Enoch for 300 years is waiting to walk with you for whatever time he gives you on this earth. The only question left is, will you take that first step? Enoch's story began with a baby named Methuselah and a father who decided to respond to that moment by walking with God. Your story can begin today with whatever moment you're in right now, and your decision to start walking with the same God who found Enoch so delightful that he simply had to bring him home. What will you choose? How will your story begin? The God who walked with Enoch is waiting to walk with you. The journey of a lifetime, the adventure of eternity, the transformation of your character, the impact on your legacy. It all starts with one simple step. Take it. Your walk with God begins now. But perhaps you're thinking, this all sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I really understand what walking with God means in practical terms. Enoch lived in an ancient world that was very different from mine. How do I apply his example to my modern life with its unique challenges and complexities? That's a fair question, and it deserves a thoughtful answer. While the external circumstances of our lives are certainly different from Enoch's, the fundamental human condition remains the same. We still face moral choices. We still struggle with relationships. We still deal with uncertainty and fear. We still long for meaning and purpose. We still need wisdom beyond our own understanding. Let me give you some specific, practical ways that you can begin walking with God in your 21st century life. Start with prayer, but think of it as conversation rather than religious ritual. Prayer doesn't have to be formal or fancy or filled with religious language. It's simply talking with God about your life, your concerns, your hopes, your fears, your questions, your gratitude. You can pray while you're driving to work, asking God to give you wisdom for the meetings you'll face that day. You can pray while you're exercising, thanking God for your health and asking for strength to make good choices about caring for your body. You can pray when you're struggling with a relationship, asking for patience and understanding and love. You can pray when you're making a difficult decision, asking God to show you the right path. You can pray when you're worried about your children, asking God to protect them and guide them. You can pray when you're feeling overwhelmed by circumstances, asking God for peace and perspective. The point is to include God in your real life, not just in formal religious activities. Enoch walked with God through all of his daily activities, and you can do the same. Read the Bible, but read it as a love letter from God, rather than as a textbook to be studied. The Bible is God's way of communicating with human beings about who He is, what He's like, how He feels about us, and what He wants for our lives. Start with the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, and read about Jesus. Ask yourself, what does this teach me about God's character? How does this apply to my life? What is God saying to me through this passage? Don't worry if you don't understand everything at first. Even people who have been reading the Bible for decades continue to discover new insights and applications. The goal isn't to become a biblical scholar overnight. The goal is to hear from God and learn to recognize His voice. Practice the presence of God throughout your day. This is what Enoch did for 300 years, and it's what enabled him to walk so closely with God that translation became possible. When you wake up in the morning, acknowledge God's presence and ask for His guidance throughout the day. When you're eating breakfast, thank God for providing for your needs. When you're facing a challenging situation at work, silently ask God for wisdom and strength. When you see something beautiful in nature, thank God for His creativity. When someone is kind to you, recognize God's love being expressed through that person. When you're tempted to respond with anger or selfishness, ask God to help you respond with His character instead. The goal is to develop such an awareness of God's presence that your whole life becomes a continual conversation with Him. This doesn't mean you're constantly praying out loud or walking around in a religious trance. It means you're living with the consciousness that God is with you, that He cares about your life, and that He wants to be involved in everything you do. Make integrity a priority in all your dealings. This is where Enoch's walk with God was tested daily, and it's where your walk with God will be tested as well. Integrity means doing the right thing even when it's costly, telling the truth even when it's inconvenient, keeping your word even when it's difficult. In our modern world, this might mean being honest on your tax returns, even when you could probably get away with small deceptions. It might mean treating employees fairly, even when you could maximize profits by exploiting them. It might mean keeping your marriage vows even when your feelings change or difficulties arise. It might mean being truthful in your business dealings even when dishonesty would be more profitable. It might mean speaking kindly about others even when gossip would be more entertaining. It might mean doing excellent work even when your boss isn't watching. These choices made consistently over time shape your character and deepen your relationship with God. They demonstrate that your walk with God is real, not just theoretical. They prove that your faith affects your behavior, not just your beliefs. Invest in relationships with other people who are also trying to walk with God. Enoch didn't live in isolation. He was part of a community connected to a family engaged with his generation. While his relationship with God was personal, it wasn't private. Find a church where the Bible is taught and God is honored. Join a small group where you can ask questions, share struggles, and learn from others who are further along in their spiritual journey. Develop friendships with people who share your desire to walk with God. These relationships will encourage you when you're discouraged, challenge you when you're becoming complacent, and support you when you're facing difficulties. They'll also give you opportunities to encourage, challenge, and support others, which is part of what it means to walk with God. Practice gratitude as a spiritual discipline. One of the characteristics of people who walk closely with God is a deep sense of gratitude for His goodness and provision. Enoch lived for 300 years with an awareness of God's faithfulness, and that awareness surely included profound gratitude. Make it a habit to thank God for specific blessings in your life, your family, your health, your home, your work, your friendships, your opportunities, your freedoms. Thank Him for answered prayers, for protection from dangers you may not even be aware of, for His patience with your failures and weaknesses. When you develop a habit of gratitude, you begin to see God's hand in your life more clearly. You start to recognize His provision, His protection, His guidance, His love. You become more aware of His presence and more confident in His care. Seek to serve others as an expression of your walk with God. Enoch's relationship with God didn't make him self-absorbed or disconnected from human needs. If anything, it made him more sensitive to suffering and more committed to helping others. Look for ways to demonstrate God's love through practical service. This might mean volunteering at a local charity, helping elderly neighbors with yard work, providing meals for families in crisis, or simply being kind and helpful to people you encounter in everyday life. When you serve others in God's name, you're not just helping them. You're also expressing your love for God and deepening your relationship with Him. You're participating in His work in the world. You're becoming an instrument of His love and grace. Handle money according to biblical principles. How you use your financial resources is often a reflection of what you really believe about God and His provision. Enoch lived in a world where economic pressures were intense and corruption was common. Yet he maintained integrity in his business dealings, practiced generous giving to God's work and to those in need. Budget carefully and avoid debt when possible. Be content with what you have rather than constantly wanting more. Use your resources to bless others rather than just to accumulate possessions. When you handle money according to God's principles, you demonstrate trust in His provision. You show that your security comes from Him, not from your bank account. You prove that your walk with God affects every area of your life, including your finances. Maintain hope in difficult circumstances. Enoch lived through 3 centuries in the most corrupt period of human history, yet he never lost hope in God's ultimate plan. He maintained faith even when immediate circumstances seemed hopeless. When you're facing challenges, remember that God sees the big picture even when you can only see your immediate situation. Trust that He's working even when you can't see evidence of His activity. Believe that He has good plans for your life, even when current circumstances are painful. This doesn't mean being naive about difficulties or pretending that problems don't exist. It means maintaining confidence in God's character and His ultimate purposes, even when you can't understand His methods or timing. Study the Bible to understand God's character and ways. Enoch's relationship with God was built on understanding who God really is, not on assumptions or cultural opinions about spirituality. The more you understand God's character as revealed in Scripture, the deeper your relationship with Him can become. Read about God's love, His justice, His mercy, His faithfulness, His wisdom, His power. Study the stories of how He has worked in people's lives throughout history. Learn about His promises and His plans. When you understand God's character, you're better equipped to trust Him in difficult times, to recognize His work in your life, and to reflect His nature in your relationships with others. Practice forgiveness as both a gift to others and a discipline for yourself. Enoch lived in a violent world where people regularly hurt each other, yet he maintained a heart that was aligned with God's heart. This would have required supernatural ability to forgive those who wronged him. When someone hurts you, choose to forgive them rather than holding on to bitterness and resentment. This doesn't mean pretending that the hurt didn't happen or that consequences shouldn't follow. It means releasing your right to revenge and trusting God to handle justice. Forgiveness frees you from the poison of bitterness and opens your heart to experience God's love more fully. It also demonstrates that your walk with God is affecting your character in practical ways. Develop disciplines of simplicity and contentment. In our consumer-driven culture, it's easy to believe that happiness comes from having more possessions, more experiences, more achievements. But Enoch's 300-year walk with God suggests that true satisfaction comes from relationship with the Creator, not from accumulating created things. Practice being content with what you have rather than constantly wanting more. Choose quality over quantity in your possessions. Focus on relationships and experiences rather than accumulating things. Give generously rather than hoarding resources. When you live simply and contentedly, you demonstrate that your security and satisfaction come from God rather than from material possessions. You also free up time and resources to invest in relationships and service to others. Share your faith naturally as opportunities arise. Enoch was a prophet who delivered God's messages to his generation, and part of walking with God involves being willing to share what you've learned about him with others. This doesn't mean becoming a street corner preacher or pestering people with unwanted religious conversations. It means being open about your faith when appropriate, answering questions honestly when people ask about your beliefs, and inviting others to explore spiritual matters when the opportunity arises. Your most powerful testimony will be the change that others see in your character and behavior as you walk with God. When people notice that you handle stress differently, treat others more kindly, make decisions with integrity, and maintain hope in difficult circumstances, they may ask questions that give you opportunities to share about your relationship with God. Finally, remember that walking with God is a marathon, not a sprint. Enoch walked with God for 300 years, which means he had to learn how to maintain faithfulness over the long term. There will be seasons when your walk feels effortless and joyful, and seasons when it feels difficult and demanding. There will be times when God's presence seems obvious and his guidance is clear, and times when he seems silent and his will is unclear. There will be periods of rapid spiritual growth and periods when progress seems slow or non-existent. The key is to keep walking regardless of how you feel or what you're experiencing. Base your commitment on God's character, not on your circumstances. Trust his faithfulness, even when you can't see his activity. Continue in obedience, even when you don't understand his purposes. Here are 5 questions you can ask yourself at the end of each week to evaluate and strengthen your walk with God. How did I create space for God in my schedule this week? Did I make time for prayer, Bible reading, and spiritual reflection? Or did I let other activities crowd out my relationship with God? Where did I sense God's presence or guidance in my daily activities? Did I notice Him working in my circumstances, speaking to my heart, or leading me in specific directions? What small choices did I make that reflected God's character? Did I respond to difficult situations with love instead of anger? Truth instead of deception? Generosity instead of selfishness? How did I remain faithful to God during difficult moments when I was tempted to compromise, discouraged by circumstances, or pressured to conform to ungodly standards? Did I choose to walk with God or to walk according to human wisdom? Who did I encourage or serve as part of my walk with God? Did I look for opportunities to demonstrate God's love to others through practical service, encouraging words, or faithful friendship? These questions aren't meant to create guilt or pressure. They're meant to help you notice where God is already working in your life and where you might want to be more intentional about walking with Him. Remember, faith isn't about achieving perfection or earning God's approval through good behavior. It's about maintaining relationship with God through all of life's circumstances and allowing that relationship to transform your character from the inside out. Enoch didn't have one perfect day repeated for 300 years. He had approximately 109,500 individual days each, with its own challenges and opportunities, each requiring fresh choices about whether to walk with God or to walk according to human wisdom. You don't need to be perfect to walk with God. You just need to be willing. You don't need to have all the answers before you begin. You just need to take the first step. You don't need to understand everything about faith and spirituality before you start walking. You just need to trust God enough to follow Him one day at a time. The God who walked with Enoch for 300 years is the same God who wants to walk with you for whatever time He gives you on this earth. The relationship that transformed Enoch's life is available to transform your life. The faith that pleased God in Enoch can please God in you. But it all begins with a decision to start walking, and it continues with a commitment to keep walking regardless of circumstances, for as long as God gives you the opportunity. If you found hope and inspiration in Enoch's story, I'd love for you to share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a family member who's struggling with doubt. Maybe it's a friend who's facing difficult circumstances. Maybe it's a coworker who's searching for meaning and purpose. Maybe it's someone in your community who needs to know that transformation is possible. Subscribe to this channel if you want more biblical stories that reveal how God works in ordinary lives to create extraordinary impact. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss future content that could encourage you in your own walk with God. And let me know in the comments, what's the first step you're going to take in your own walk with God? What specific change are you going to make in response to Enoch's example? What practical discipline are you going to adopt to deepen your relationship with the Creator? Because here's the truth that Enoch's life teaches us. God isn't looking for perfect people to walk with. He's looking for faithful people. He's looking for people who will choose to walk with Him one day at a time, one step at a time, one choice at a time, regardless of circumstances or feelings or social pressures. You don't have to be a spiritual giant to begin. You just have to be willing. You don't have to have it all figured out before you start. You just have to trust God enough to take the first step. You don't have to be qualified in human terms. You just have to be available to God's purposes. The man who walked with God for 300 years started exactly where you are right now, with a choice to trust God with his next step. That same choice is in front of you today. That same God is waiting to walk with you. That same transformation is possible for your life. The question isn't whether God is willing to walk with you. Enoch's story proves that he is. The question isn't whether walking with God makes a difference. 300 years of faithful steps and a translation that bypassed death prove that it does. The only remaining question is, what will you choose? Enoch chose to walk. That choice changed his destiny, transformed his character, influenced his family, impacted his generation, and continues to inspire people thousands of years later. Your choice to walk with God today could be the beginning of a story that outlasts anything this world considers permanent. It could be the first step of a journey that changes not just your life, but the lives of people you haven't even met yet. It could be the beginning of your own walk with the God who delights in walking with his children. The God who still invites ordinary people into extraordinary relationships. The God who still transforms lives from the inside out. The God who still creates legacies that echo through eternity. The God who walked with Enoch is calling your name today. He's inviting you to join him on the greatest adventure possible, a life lived in partnership with the Creator of the universe. Will you walk with him? The journey begins with a single step, and that step can happen right now, right where you are. Enoch's story proves that when you walk with God, you never know where that walk might lead. But you can be certain of this. It will lead somewhere beautiful. It will lead somewhere significant. It will lead somewhere eternal. Take the step. Begin the walk. Start the journey that could change everything. God is waiting. And remember, every step you take with God is a step toward becoming the person he created you to be. Every choice you make to walk in his ways is a choice that moves you closer to your true purpose and destiny. Every day you spend walking with God is a day invested in eternity. Enoch walked for 300 years and then stepped right into eternity without experiencing death. You may not be translated as he was, but you can experience the same kind of transformational relationship with God that made his translation possible. You can know the same God who walked with Enoch. You can experience the same kind of intimacy that characterized their relationship. You can develop the same kind of character that made Enoch ready for heaven. You can create the same kind of legacy that influences generations. But it all begins with a single step. A step of faith, a step of trust, a step toward the God who has been waiting for you since before you were born. Take that step today. Your walk with God begins now.